Welcome back. Fancy Dan. Fancy Dan was not very bright. And a character like him is kind of one of those characters I'll ding the show or a particular episode on for realism, because essentially he was involved in what was a non-violent racket in general. And he makes these decisions to start killing people, which just complicate everything far more than, anything else he was concerned about. To just hide the first guy who came there needing help and laying low or getting out of town was a whole lot better than dealing with all of the questions, the problems, and the challenges that come with killing off someone, just from that pure practical standpoint. And it's a bit incongruous, you work up this clever scam to, have a sort of semi-legitimate looking enterprise so that you can fleece some people, and so show some cleverness there. And then you just start, killing off your own men in a counterproductive effort to keep the law off your back. It just doesn't make sense to me. Unless, I don't know, you're about to blow town with all the winnings and you're double-crossing all of the people who worked for you. But even then, you would have to have a bigger take than you'd get from like one charity gambling scam in order to even make that, even make sense from the criminal perspective. I just don't see the logic of it. Although I did like the twist about Fancy Dan being the actual last victim and it being a little bit of a surprise as to who did it. That was a nice feature. All right, well, listener comments and feedback now, and this one comes from Amy. She writes, I'm still a little behind, but I heard your thoughts from a few weeks ago on The Saint and would encourage you to watch The Saint in New York starring Lewis Hayward. This was 1938, so America hadn't turned against the anti-hero aspect of The Saint quite yet, and Hayward plays him like no other. He has a list of bad guys who will meet their doom at his hands, and of course the police can't let him do it. Hayward later was in the TV series The Lone Wolf. I'm not sure if you played any of those on video theater, but I'd love to see one. Thanks again for all you do. I originally subscribed to the Box 13 episodes, but I've since discovered a real enjoyment of the detective genre thanks to you. I now understand why so many people have said Johnny Dollar was their favorite old-time radio, but I was hesitant to listen and think it was more of a guy's program. I'm so happy to be wrong. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your comment, Amy, and definitely old-time radio is for everyone, and even was so back in the day, with a wide variety of all genders and races listening to all the different programs. Thanks so much for the suggestion of The Saint in New York. It's a bit challenging just because they haven't put that one or the last of the classic Saint films, which also starred Lewis Hayward. Those haven't been released on DVD. But I would like to see it, just if for no other reason than to, I can definitely do with seeing a Saint film. I love the George Sanders ones, and the Hugh Sinclair ones are fine. And of course, love the Roger Moore TV series. I should clarify, my problem with a lot of the portrayals of the Saint and Boston Blackie isn't that they are moving away from, say, the anti-hero roots. It's that, particularly when I commented on it, that the fact that it was essentially implied in this episode that Blackie had never, been in trouble with the law. I have no problem with Blackie being a reformed thief, but when you just kind of take that out, and I think it was definitely there earlier, in the series. But when you take that out, it's just a compromise of the character. Certainly, I actually quite enjoy how characters change, become more reformed, honest, law-abiding, but just as long as they don't try to pretend that it's always been that way, because then that's just not being true to the character. As for the Lone Wolf TV series, I did see a few episodes of it, and I quite enjoyed it. Unfortunately, that series is actually under copyright, so I wouldn't be able to play that. But thanks so much for the comment, Amy. I appreciate you writing in, and so glad to be able to introduce you to so many great detective programs that you've enjoyed. All right, I want to go ahead and thank our Patreon supporter of the day, and I want to thank Cheryl Lee. Cheryl Lee has been one of our Patreon supporters since March of 2018, currently supporting us at the Master Detective level of $15 or more per month. Thanks so much for your support, Cheryl Lee. And that will actually do it for today. Join us back here tomorrow for yours truly, Johnny Dollar. Next Thursday, another episode of Boston Blackie. In the meantime, send your comments to box13@greatdetectives.net. Follow us on Twitter at Radio Detectives and become one of our friends on Facebook. Facebook.com/Radio Detectives. From Boise, Idaho, this is your host, Adam Graham, signing off.
Welcome to Murderific Podcast. This is our first podcast, so I'm pretty excited about that. My name's Bernadette, and my first guest for the first week is Casey.
Howdy, folks.
Oh, my God. Oh, no.
Oh, she told me not to say howdy.
It's going to be like this?
Hello, folks.
Oh, no. So before we get started, I thought we should maybe talk about our true crime route, which is how you got into true crime, the things that interest you about true crime. I got into true crime originally because I remember seeing Ted Bundy on the news, and like the 6 o'clock news, like the crimes he had committed, his execution. And then I remember seeing shows about Ted Bundy, and this is like when I was 13. So I was very impressionable. And I thought he was really, really good looking.
As you'll find out in later podcasts, Ted Bundy was one of Burns' crushes.
No. There was a movie about him called Deliberate Stranger in 1986. He was played by Mark Harmon, and it scared me so much. And I was like sucked in from that point on. That was my true crime route. What about you?
Well, my formative years were the mid to late 80s. As such, I was drawn to the crimes of the time. Most notably, whom I recall vividly were Jeffrey Dahmer and the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. They both had a similar reign of terror beginning in the late 70s, progressing through the 80s, or peaking in the 80s, escalating in the late 80s, early 90s when they were both caught. Both were fascinating to me for various reasons. And also, Unsolved Mysteries was huge back in the day. Robert Stack with that creepy eye.
I feel like I was too young to watch that, but I remember watching America's Most Wanted.
And if you look close, Robert Stack doesn't blink very much.
That's true. He's like a weirdo. Oh, and the Jodi Arias trial also kept me captivated for a good 2 years. So the case we're talking about today is going to be John Joseph Joubert, who happens to be a serial killer who committed crimes in Maine and Nebraska. He committed 3 murders at only age 19 from 1982 to 1983. We will get started with his early life and just jump right in. He was also called Nebraska Boy Snatcher, the Schoolboy Snatcher, and the Woodford Snatcher.
Side note, there's an actual punk band out there called the Nebraska Boy Snatchers.
Really?
There is.
We need to listen to that.
It's a little screamy.
Oh.
It's punk.
So, John Joseph Joubert's early life. He was born July 2nd, 1963 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He grew up angry, teased, isolated from his father by his mother. His parents divorced at age 9, and he had to live with his overly controlling mother. He was not allowed to see his father. He was also spanked until the age of 13, which is insane. Can you imagine being spanked until you are age 13?
I still like it.
That's over the top. A very bright child, he was reading at age 3 and taking books out of the library at age 5. His IQ is 123, which is an above average intelligence.
And slightly below mine.
Sure, Casey. At age 6, he thought his mom and babysitter were trying to break up the family, and he thought about killing and cannibalizing her. Later in interviews, he said, quote, "Nothing personal, just someone to kill," end quote. In 1971, John moved into a rundown apartment with his mom. He was an outcast in school, so he joined the Boy Scouts. This was the time he started thinking about murdering strangers on the street and binding and gagging anyone who resisted. In 1974, he moved to Portland, Maine, and his mother got a job as a bookkeeper. In 1975, John admitted to being a homosexual, and more teasing and bullying followed. Before we get started on the murders, I'd like to do a little disclaimer here. Discretion, rated R, trigger warning. If you don't want to hear about gratuitous violence, rape, murder, gore, torture, child murder, sexual violence, etc., you should probably stop listening here. But if you are brave enough, you can keep listening. Just to let you know, what's coming up will be disturbing to some viewers.
From 1976 through 1979, ages 13 through 16, Schubert, the outcast at school, skinny little punk, started stabbing people. He stabbed 9-year-old girl Sarah Canty in the back with a pencil. This became the first of several attacks.
In Portland, Maine.
After he got away with that, he slashed another girl with a razor blade while riding on his bicycle. A few years later, he attacked an 8-year-old boy, Chris Day, and nearly strangled him to death. You could see his offenses were gradually increasing, and he never got caught for these early offenses. In 1980, just a couple of months apart, he attacked a 27-year-old student going to the University of Maine. He stabbed her in the stomach and critically injured her. Just a couple of months later, in March of 1980, he attacked a 9-year-old boy, Michael Witham, savagely cut the boy's throat, but the boy survived.
August 22nd, 1982, when John was only 19 years old, in Portland, Maine, 11-year-old Ricky Stetson went for a walk at Back Cove. He was a small boy with red hair and freckles. When he hadn't returned by dark, his parents called the police. He was discovered the next day off 295 Interstate. Police first thought it was a hit and run because of the proximity near the interstate. He was found half undressed, stabbed several times, and strangled. He had bite marks all over, and the bite marks had been gorged with a knife. This was to become John Joseph Joubert's signature. The bites, the cutting, the strangulation, and the stabbing. There was no sexual assault on the first victim. Cops also picked up a suspect and held him for a year and a half, but the teeth marks didn't match and he was released.
So his signature, he would actually try and stab the bite wounds to cover up the bite wounds. Immediately after killing Ricky Stetson, Joubert moved to Bellevue, Nebraska, joined the Air Force at Offutt Air Base.
So there was a year gap between the crimes. On September 18th, 1983, in Bellevue, Nebraska, Danny Joel Eberly, 13 years old, disappeared while delivering newspapers on his paper route. Danny's brother also had a delivery route and remembered being followed by a white man in a tan car the day before. Danny was at house 4 out of 70 on his route. His bike was found there and the rest of the newspapers also. Joubert took out a knife and covered Danny's mouth and forced him into his car, drove him to a gravel road outside of town. 3 days later, Danny was found on the gravel road 4 miles from his bike, stripped to his underwear, hands and feet bound, mouth taped with surgical tape, and knife wounds on his body, suggesting that he had been tortured. He was sexually assaulted and strangled. The FBI was called in at this point because it was a kidnapping. The police looked to Robert Ressler for clues and a profile, which we will talk about later. And of course, we all know Robert Ressler from his time in the FBI and also coining the phrase serial killer.
He worked on prolific cases like Dahmer and Bundy. I want to mention a story of when I was a paper boy. Actually, my brother had a paper route, and he didn't actually like doing the delivering.
Oh, weird. Just the money part he liked?
He just liked the money part. So he subcontracted me a lot of cuts. I made a lot of money on his paper route, and he didn't make that much. But anyway, the way it worked for us was that the paper company would actually drive by your house around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and dump a stack of papers on your front lawn. Paper boy would then take that stack, and then there's a certain way you have to fold the papers in order to slide them in through the doors and such. So we start at the wee hours of the morning, around 4 or 5 a.m., and it's pretty dark, and it's really kind of scary and sketchy out at that time. Well, one day I was actually approached by 2 men in a white van.
A white van.
A white van. The proverbial white van.
Rape van.
So, I wasn't so scared. I grew up in a really small town, but it was still, I guess, shocking to some degree that I was approached on my route. It turns out they didn't want to kidnap me and kill me, but they wanted to buy a newspaper. At least that's what they said. I wasn't going to get close enough to the van to actually sell them a newspaper and get abducted. So I can imagine that this happens quite a bit.
Just goes to show how different things were in the 1980s, where you would let, your 13 or 14 or 12-year-old son by themselves in the morning. It's really, really scary. The third crime happened 3 months later, December 2nd, 1983, in Papillion, Nebraska. 12-year-old Christopher Walden was kidnapped on his way to school. Jobert later said he drove up to Walden, showed him his knife, and got him into the car. Witnesses said again they saw a white man with a tan car. He drove the boy out of town, ordered him to undress, which the boy did down to his underwear. But he refused to lay down, which made Jobert upset. Jobert then overpowered Christopher. He was found by hunters in the snow 2 days later, hidden in a grove of trees outside of town. He had star-shaped cuts to cover his bite marks. He was choked and stabbed several times and found with his neck cut so deep that he was nearly decapitated. This last murder was more concealed, and it was believed the boy was killed immediately after being abducted.
If you look at some of the crime scene photos, even though he was more concealed than his other victims, he was still in an open field with just a little bit of brush around.
It seems like his crimes started out pretty disorganized, and then maybe by the third one, he was starting to evolve a little bit and become more organized like serial killers do.
Less frantic, less rushed, a little bit more collected. So Walden was found in the same area as Eberly with the same star-shaped knife pattern, which is Schubert's signature.
As we said before, Robert Ressler joined the case with the FBI to establish a profile. His profile said they were looking for a young offender from late teens to early 20s, a friendly-looking man, and the method of dumping suggested panic instead of experience. The perp knew the area, no more than a high school education, and the perp was probably single and a deviant, obviously. Loner and a latent homosexual. He could be a coach or a Boy Scout leader.
One of the witnesses in Christopher Walden's case underwent hypnosis to recall details of the point where she saw Joubert and Walden walking together and then leaving in a brown car. She also recalled the license started with an R And from that recollection, they were able to build a composite sketch of Joubert. So just a quick story on my Boy Scout tenure.
How long was that?
Very brief. I didn't last very long.
Like a month? 2 months before they kicked you out?
Nearly a year.
How do you get kicked out of the Boy Scouts?
Well, that's a story for another day. All right, so my point here is that becoming an Eagle Scout takes several years to attain. Joubert was an Eagle Scout. He spent several years in the Boy Scouts. And although most or many serial killers have an antisocial personality disorder, like Gacy, he was outwardly normal. He was interacting with other kids, other adults, and eventually he became a troop leader. Ironically, he would have to discuss the murders with his troop at one of the scout meetings.
That is so weird.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Hey kids, here's how you keep safe at night.
Oh my God. Oh my God, I just got goosebumps. January 11th, 1984, a suspicious man was seen loitering around a preschool in Bellevue. He saw a woman writing down his license plate and challenged her, shoved her, and told her that he would kill her. He then ran to a nearby car and drove away. So he actually saw a woman writing his license plate down, got out of his car, walked into the school, and said, "I'm going to kill you."
Yeah. Barbara Weaver, she worked in a daycare center, so she was attuned to things that were going on in her neighborhood. She was aware of the serial killer. Because of the close proximity of the killings, she knew that was, in the area. She had a composite sketch of what he looked like. When she saw this guy sitting in the parking lot, she became suspicious.
At a preschool. The rented car was traced to 20-year-old John Joseph Joubert, an enlisted man at the nearby Offutt Air Base. He fit the FBI profile and resembled the composite sketches.
Wait a minute. Did you just call him Joubert?
Yeah, Joubert. The French way of saying Joubert.
Joubert.
How do you say it?
Joubert is French.
Joubert. Joubert.
We're English speakers, so you can say Joubert. Get away with it.
I can say Joubert because that's how it's supposed to be. Police got a search warrant and found rope identical to the Danny Eberly bindings. The rope was manufactured in Korea and rarely used in the United States.
So the rope had some significant differences of standard rope. Had a white nylon outside, which appeared normal or like other rope. But the inner core was made of 24 different types of fibers, 106 different colored yarns, various polyesters, rayons, etc. So it was very unique.
Hard to be like, oh, that's not mine.
Right, especially since it was in his car.
And military rope. More rope and a hunting knife were found in his car, and Joubert was arrested that night. In custody, he confessed to 2 local Nebraska murders, warning detectives that he would definitely kill again if he was released. He was charged with 2 counts of homicide on January 12, 1984. He was held on a $10 million bond. He pled guilty to 2 counts of murder on July 3rd, 1984, and a panel of 3 judges sentenced him to death.
As a native of Portland, Maine, Joubert was again making waves at home. A detective noticed the similarities of the Nebraska murders to Ricky Stetson's murder in 1982. Hair samples and bite mark impressions were obtained from Joubert in February of 1985, and he was indicted for Richie Stetson's murder in Maine, January 10, 1986. He was sentenced to life imprisonment because Maine did not have the death penalty.
Maine investigators and Ressler came to believe that Joubert was responsible for the other Maine assaults as well that we already spoke about. While he was in prison, several psychiatric evaluations were done. The psychiatrist said that he was obsessive-compulsive, had sadistic tendencies, a schizoid personality disorder, but he was found to not be psychotic at the time of his crimes. Robert Ressler also interviewed him in prison, saying he was a sexual sadist, an organized offender, and a pedophile. During these interviews, Jobert requested his crime photos of his murder. His request was denied. Can you imagine? You're being interviewed and he's like, can I see the pictures of the crimes that I committed?
Give me some of those naked boy pictures, please.
Fuck no. Fuck off. He said before his death, his fantasies had gone away and that he had a girlfriend. He had an interview with a reporter less than a month before his death, and here are some of the excerpt for you.
I believe that I would never kill anyone again, if that's what you mean by reformed. Yes, I know that I could never harm anyone. You never can know because obviously I'm never going to be trusted again. And second, I'm never going to be released, so it's never going to be put to the test.
Weirdly enough, drawings were released to the public recently that he drew when he was in prison. One was a boy without hands or feet who was hogtied. The second drawing was of a man stabbing a young boy who was bound and blindfolded. July 17, 1996, Jobert was executed by the state of Nebraska. After the first vault, John's head caught on fire and he died screaming in the electric chair. Afterwards, an examination revealed a 4-inch brain blister on top of his head and severe blistering above his ears. So, Green Mile style.
Green Mile style. Ouchies.
Witnesses saw smoke coming from his head. After that, there were no more executions in the state of Nebraska until 2016, when they repealed the short-lived abolition of the death penalty.
Jubert was the youngest person on death row at that time.
So that was our first podcast, the story of John Joseph Jobert. Thank you for listening to our first podcast. Please visit us at www.murderific.com. Make sure to leave us a review on iTunes. Until next time, we'll be executing podcast one crime at a time.
If you're going to do something, do it well. And leave something with you. Leave a sign to let the world know that you were there. Have a good day.
Welcome to the second Murderific podcast. With me, Bernadette. My guest today is my sister and guest writer, and her name is Rebecca.
Hello.
We're going to do a pre-shot today, and our drink of choice is, what is it?
Milagro tequila.
Right.
All right, ready?
Just to get ready. Here we go. And my shot glass has Ted Bundy.
Fun fact, Ted Bundy in a movie was Bernadette's first crush, which probably leads us to why we're recording a true crime podcast today. She's a weirdo.
Ted Bundy in real life, you mean?
No, it's gross.
But it's real.
All right.
And your shot glass is John Wayne Gacy.
Not my first crush.
He's not very cute.
No.
At all.
Gross.
So today we're going to talk about the story of an unidentified serial killer in Edgecombe and Halifax County in North Carolina, who worked from 2003 to 2009. A serial killer who might be still active, alive, and dangerous. He has evaded justice by following a simple evil plan, by preying on Black women who have fallen through the cracks of society with drug abuse and prostitution. Women not captivating to white media, women who will not be missed. Which sounds like a big media story, right? Yet most of these people have never been heard of.
Before you brought this story to my attention, I had never even heard of it. And what's important to note is that the size of this town is super small. It's only 500 miles big. And the number that was killed, what was it?
10 to 12.
10 to 12 wasn't even coming up in the normal news story. Nobody even knew about it,
right.
Which is nuts.
There are 10 to 12 suspected victims, all African-American women and one cross-dresser. The remains of all but one have been found. Rocky Mount, North Carolina is a small town of 60,000, home to an abundance of poverty and drugs. 20% are living below the poverty level, and 56% of the residents are Black. It has a crack cocaine epidemic, with houses with shuttered windows and a railroad track between the Black and white people in town.
So next we're going to introduce the victims in order that they were found.
We did a lot of research on the victims, but the information was pretty sketchy to non-existent. We will do our best to tell you about their personalities and bring a face to them. The first victim found was Denise Williams. She was 21. She was found in a swamp southeast of town in 2003. Unlike the other women, she was not a prostitute. She did have an on-off-again drug problem. She is one of the victims, along with Travis Harrison, who we will discuss later, not always included in the list of Edgecombe victims.
The second victim that was found was named Melody Wiggins. She was 29. She was found May 29th in 2005. She had multiple stab wounds, a blunt force trauma on her head, and she was partially clothed. Her mother, Shelley, said she had a bad feeling that her daughter was dead after hearing about a body being found on TV. Melody had a son who was with his grandmother, and he used to say, "Grandma, have they found out who did it to my mama?"
That's so sad. It's so sad.
Melody's mom would say, "Not yet, but the Lord knows who did it."
Oh, the Lord works in mysterious ways.
Non-existent ways.
Non-existent. Doesn't give a shit ways. The third victim, Jackie Thorpe, 35, who people called Nikki, was found August 17th, 2007, in a pile of trash, nude. She had been missing since May 8, 2007. She was found behind a house on Seven Bridges Road in Edgecombe County, found behind a crack house. Her mother told police that she frequented areas where drugs were sold, and she was a crack user. She would disappear for 3 to 4 weeks at a time, but always reconnected with her family.
Nikki grew up playing football with the boys in the projects. She had been a cheerleader in high school. She wrote poetry and played bingo. She had a talent for braiding hair, which was regarded highly by crack dealers who sometimes gave her drugs. Drugs for a hair job instead of a blow job.
I would give somebody drugs to get my hair braided.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Mm-hmm.
When she was found, she was so decomposed that the examiners could not determine the cause of death, and her head and arm had been cut off. I think what's interesting about Jackie Thorpe is that she was found only 200 yards from another victim that you're going to hear about, last name Hardgrove.
Before that, though, I'd like to introduce a clip of Nikki Thorpe's mom speaking about her daughter.
Tell me a little bit about your daughter.
She was high-spirited, always had a smile, didn't know any strangers. She was a good mom, like a sister instead of mom, I'm in charge type person. She was always, my perfect little girl. I reported her missing on the 4th day. I called and said, I think something's going on. What'd they tell you? Truthfully, I told them more than they told me, because me and 2 or 3 of my girlfriends would go to the areas where they roam, just checking. And so I would call like every 2 to 3 days. Have you heard anything? No, Miss Wiggins. Have you heard anything? And I'm feeding them what I've learned just by going through the streets. And
Did you feel like they were taking your missing persons report seriously at all?
I really don't think they took it as a mom reporting her child missing. I don't.
You think they heard prostitute, drug addict?
I do. Yes, I do.
You got that knock on the door. What was that like?
Relief, hurt. The anger. How am I going to tell her kids? And I was so frustrated with the police. Because I really felt if they had really taken me seriously, busting in some of these houses I told them about, even though she wasn't found in one of those houses, none of that was done. They were still human. They were still somebody's child, somebody's mother. They still had lives that they lived before that got that low with their addiction and with the prostitution and the arrests. They were good people. It's just hard to let people realize or to see the other side. And so I've been trying to speak for her because she can't anymore.
The 4th victim, Ernestine Battle, age 50, was found March 13th, 2008. She was found in the same area as Jackie Thorpe in the woods. She went missing more than a month earlier. She was last seen by her sister getting into an unknown car with an unknown black man.
She was a prostitute who mostly sold her body for crack, not money. She had been in and out of jail for 9 years and lost custody of her 2 children, but she always kept in contact with them. She was found face down and naked. Police say she was probably strangled, but could not be sure as animals had contact with her body. An animal had drug away a small throat bone that typically breaks off when someone is strangled.
Her sister, Cornita Battle, said, quote, "She had her lifestyle and ways, but she was a loving person. It's somebody that has they have to have had something against ladies with a lifestyle like this."
So far we've talked about 4 victims, and the tying thread between all of them is prostitution and drug use, right?
Right, their lifestyle, no job, drugs.
Selling their body for drugs.
Right.
Seemingly disposable victims.
The 5th person found was Elizabeth Jane Smallwood, found 1 year after she was killed under a brush pile. 33-year-old Elizabeth was found February 13th, 2009 by a prison crew doing road work near U.S. Route 64. She had been missing for about a year, and nobody seems to have noticed. It seems that she had no family that cared about her, no history, and she was not living in a home. She had a lengthy criminal record.
She was a known prostitute and drug addict. Smallwood was the only woman who was not reported missing to the police. It took much work and extensive background checks to actually identify the body. They found her dad and made phone contact with him. He said he hadn't spoken to her in years. Her body was even unclaimed at the morgue, and eventually a funeral home in the area had to take care of it themselves.
She had been known to hang around motels along Route 301 and also hung around with some of the other victims, including Jackie Thorpe.
It seems like with a lot of these girls, nobody is reporting them missing. No one notices that they're missing for 6 months or a year.
Well, I mean, say you're a prostitute, they know you're going off on drug binges. They know that
Right.
don't care about your kids. So you could be gone for 3 weeks, and they'd be like, oh, she's just doing her thing. But like this victim, nobody gave a shit.
Yep.
They told her dad, and her dad didn't even claim her at the morgue.
Right. So they definitely have no, support system, strong family structure.
Right.
And I feel like the only other people that would notice that they were missing was other women that were working with her. And there's no reason for them to come forward and report because they're going to get in trouble for prostituting.
Right. Plus, they don't believe in the police.
Right.
It's not a thing, talking to the police.
Our next victim was named Tara Nicholson, 29, found dead March 7th, 2009. People riding all-terrain vehicles found the body in Rocky Mountain. She had tried to clean herself up a few times over the years from drugs, but her boyfriend would shake crack rocks at her to make her relapse. Her mother warned her about people in her profession going missing, and Tara said, "I don't jump into cars with people I don't know," suggesting she was familiar with her killer or her Johns, and she had probably seen him around the neighborhood.
They found her strangled. She was found 1 week after she was reported missing. Because she was found so fast, they actually found the perp's DNA semen inside of her. A suspect named Antoine Pittman was charged in Tara Nicholson's murder. He was first arrested in July after he failed to update his address as a registered sex offender. A month later, while he was in jail, he was charged in September of 2009. We are going to revisit this victim in detail because this is the only victim connected to Antoine Pittman's charges.
Jarnice Hardgrove, nicknamed Sunshine by people who knew her, age 31, was last seen May 2nd, 2009. She was bipolar, had an 8th grade education. She loved bright colors and dyed her hair bright yellow or blue. Boys in the neighborhood loved her when she was younger. As a teenager, jealous girls would jump her. She says 7 at a time. A task force was briefly started when Jarnice's body was found, but it took 7 bodies to get the ball rolling on justice. She was found in a burnt-out house that used to be a crack den, found by a Mexican tobacco laborer. The corpse had been there for 2 months.
When the authorities